I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
You're that jaywalking punk anarchist. Jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer taking a look at The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, The New Press, 2012. The key idea of this text is that throughout U.S. history, from slavery to today, the U.S. has had social structures in place that repress people of color, and that in our modern era, this system exists via the prison industrial complex. And in this text, this system is of course called the New Jim Crow. Let's take a look at the text in depth. Chapter 1, The Rebirth of Caste. This chapter is about the history of racialized social control in the United States.
Hey everybody, it's Tristan from Step Back History. And I'm here to give a little bit of a backstory about how we got to the New Jim Crow. The New Jim Crow actually begins with discussions about American slavery. The text actually begins with a discussion about how racism was used to justify slavery. For example, Michelle Alexander says on page 24, and since I'm not very good at memorizing things, I'm just going to read it for you, friends. The growing demand for labor on plantations was met through slavery. American Indians were considered unsuitable as slaves, largely because native tribes were clearly in a position to fight back. The fear of raids by Indian tribes led plantation owners to grasp for an alternative source of free labor. Now I'm a historian who likes to overcomplicate stuff like this, but the critical thing to mention here is that racism itself does have a history. The explicit link between skin color and slavery, at least in America, solidified around Bacon's Rebellion. Before then, there was still a strong supply of indentured servants coming over from Europe. They could do similar work and died before the people who paid for their voyage over actually had to give them any of the things they promised. However, as the lifespans of these indentured servants in America began to lengthen and they became more numerous and entitled to the things that they were promised when they came over, they started to get more and more insistent on getting those things, and Bacon's Rebellion really was the time when this switched. I can't get too much into what Bacon's Rebellion was about, but basically after Bacon's Rebellion, plantation owners and rich people relied less on indentured servants from Europe and decided to lean heavily on purchased slaves from Africa. Or let's be a little bit more accurate and say that purchased slaves from the Caribbean, because slaves were originally purchased in Africa, brought over to the Caribbean where they would be quote-unquote seasoned, which would basically be a situation in which they would work to see which ones had a immunity, or at least a partial immunity to malaria, and those that survived that would then be sold to the American colonies. Anyways, this reliance on African slaves solidified into law, and the link between skin color and servitude was now codified. Before then, though, things were a little bit more complex. Racism was a lot more fluid and strange. I'd suggest checking out works like Mine Own Ground, which is the story of a black man who was purchased, grew up in slavery, was able to work, make enough money to buy his own freedom, then purchase the freedom of his wife and children, buy his own plantation and his own slaves. This is, by the way, in the 13 colonies. Really, in this time, the hierarchy was whether or not you owned land. I really have to apologize for this. There's so much noise going on outside right now. After Bacon's Rebellion, slavery persisted until a group of classical liberals who were mad at all of these anti-slavery SJWs broke off from the United States and made the Confederate States of America. They then soundly got their asses beaten, and, well, the rest is history. By the end of the American Civil War, the US had passed the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery, but there were exceptions. Farming still takes a lot of manual labor, and the ruling class was not going to get their own hands dirty. So after the Civil War, a lot of the former Confederate states passed things called Black Codes, which were basically laws that were against things like vagrancy, i.e. not having a home. So black people who were not super well off were forced to basically not leave the property of the plantations that they worked on. And basically it prevented them from looking for new jobs. So what that resulted in is often a lot of black people in the South were forced to work for the plantations that their ancestors had previously been slaves for. The 13th Amendment did end the practice of forced labor, but it had one exception. You could sentence forced labor as the punishment for a crime. And Michelle Alexander points out that this became the new way of using crime and prisons as a way to get more coerced labor. It's got another quote for you, friends, from page 28. 9 southern states adopted vagrancy laws, which essentially made it a criminal offense not to work, and were applied selectively to blacks, and 8 of those states enacted convict laws, allowing for the hiring out of county prisoners to plantation owners and private companies. Prisoners were forced to work for little or no pay. Sound familiar? Alexander continues on page 31. Death rates were shockingly high, for private contractors had no interest in the health and well-being of their laborers, unlike the early slave owners who needed their slaves at a minimum to be healthy enough to survive hard labor. So things, if anything, got even worse for these new convict slaves. Now, these laws could work during the age of Jim Crow when there were laws in the books that officially discriminated against black people, but that would not survive the civil rights movement, formally. Anyway, let's go back to the book, page 38. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 formally dismantled the Jim Crow system of discrimination in public accommodations, employment, voting, education, and federally financed activities. To continue a source of unpaid labor, the language shifted away from support for Jim Crow. Opposition relied more on that prison angle. In order to continue a system of unpaid labor, those that were pro-slavery had to move away from support for Jim Crow and find another tack, which basically means relying more on that prisoner angle rather than the whole sharecropper angle they were doing earlier. Alexander continues from page 40 to 41. From the mid-1950s until the late 1960s, conservatives systematically linked opposition to civil rights legislation to calls for law and order. So over the next few decades, deindustrialization and ghettoization led us into the conditions that we enter into in chapter 2, and what is called by Alexander the New Jim Crow. Or as Alexander would put it on page 58, back to the quotes. 90% of those admitted to prison for drug offenses in many states were black or Latino, yet the mass incarceration of communities of color was explained in race-neutral terms, an adaptation of the needs and demands of the current political climate. The New Jim Crow was born.
Chapter 2, The Lockdown. This chapter is about mass incarceration and the war on drugs. To start, Alexander argues that over time, laws and policies have been implemented that weaken the Fourth Amendment, which protects us against wrongful searches and seizures. Alexander looks at stop and frisks, people being searched because they didn't explicitly say no to searches, and forfeiture laws and government programs providing money for police departments to encourage searches. Alexander states, virtually all constitutionally protected civil liberties have been undermined by the drug war. The court has been busy in recent years approving mandatory drug testing for employees and students, upholding random searches and sweeps of public schools and students, permitting police to obtain search warrants based on an anonymous informant's tip, expanding the government's wiretapping authority, legitimating the use of paid unidentified informants by police and prosecutors, approving the use of helicopter surveillance of homes without a warrant, and allowing the forfeiture of cash, homes, and other property based on unproven allegations of illegal drug activity. Let's take a closer look at forfeitures. Alexander defines drug forfeiture laws thusly. The state and local law enforcement agencies were granted the authority to keep, for their own use, the vast majority of cash and assets they seize when waging the drug war. These things push people into the trap that is the new Jim Crow. But then once caught, it's very hard to escape, due to having no public attorney, or being encouraged to make plea bargains, or because of 3-strike laws and mandatory minimum sentences, and also because of strict parole guidelines. As Alexander states, nearly all criminal cases are resolved through plea bargaining, a guilty plea by the defendant in exchange for some form of leniency by the prosecutor. Alexander continues, this system depends on the prison label, not prison time. Barred from public housing by law, discriminated against by private landlords, ineligible for food stamps, forced to check the box indicating a felony conviction on employment applications for nearly every job, and denied licenses for a wide range of professions. People whose only crime is drug addiction or possession of a small amount of drugs for recreational use find themselves locked out of the mainstream society and economy permanently. Chapter 3: The Color of Justice. This chapter is about how race plays into mass incarceration and the war on drugs. This is about the perception of criminals as people of color. Explaining unconscious bias, Alexander states, "The fact that you may honestly believe that you are not biased against African Americans and that you may even have black friends or relatives does not mean that you are free from unconscious bias. The relevant research by cognitive and social psychologists to date suggests that racial bias in the drug war was inevitable. Once the public consensus was constructed by political and media elites that drug crime is black and brown. And this impacts sentencing and prosecution and juries. As Alexander explains, immunizing prosecutors from claims of racial bias and failing to impose any meaningful check on the exercise of their discretion in charging, plea bargaining, transferring cases, and sentencing has created an environment in which conscious and unconscious biases are allowed to flourish."
But wait, I know that racism is wrong, and I'm not a racist. Isn't it safe to assume that these legal professionals know that racism is wrong and therefore aren't racist?
Well, let's keep reading. Numerous studies have shown that prosecutors interpret and respond to identical criminal activity differently based on the race of the offender. One widely cited study was conducted by the San Jose Mercury News. The study reviewed 700,000 criminal cases that were matched by crime and criminal history of the defendant. The analysis revealed that similarly situated whites were far more successful than African Americans and Latinos in the plea bargaining process. In fact, at virtually every stage of pre-trial negotiation, whites are more successful than non-whites. And Alexander explains that racial bias isn't just on the prosecution side, it's on the policing side as well. She states, "The theory is that black and Latino drug users are more likely than white users to obtain illegal drugs in public spaces. Therefore, easier for police to catch people rather than trying to get warrants and catch drug deals that happen indoors." Now, I've done both, so I'm not sure. I've bought drugs indoors and I've bought them on the street. And of course, nowadays, with a VPN and some cryptocurrency, folks can just buy drugs online and order them right to their doorstep. Either way, this assumption that black and Latino drug dealers will be easier to catch leads to a higher rate of police in predominantly black and Latino neighborhoods, and predominantly looking for black and Latino suspects. When, in reality, and don't lie, all races of people are doing illegal drugs.
Okay, so people have a racial bias. So what? We can't control the thoughts of individuals. If black people don't want to be arrested, they should stop doing crimes. It's as simple as that.
Well, not so simple. For one, that's incredibly unjust. It doesn't address the racial bias within policing and the courts. But not only that, let's look at this. In 2002, a team of researchers at the University of Washington decided to take the defenses of the drug war seriously. The study found that contrary to the prevailing common sense, the high arrest rates of African Americans in drug law enforcement could not be explained by rates of offending, nor could they be explained by other standard excuses such as the ease and efficiency of policing open-air drug markets, citizen complaints, crime rates, or drug-related violence. The study also debunked the assumption that white drug dealers deal indoors, making their criminal activity more difficult to detect. The study's authors concluded, based on their review and analysis of the empirical evidence, that the Seattle Police Department's decisions to focus so heavily on crack to the near exclusion of other drugs, and to concentrate its efforts on outdoor drug markets in downtown areas rather than drug markets located indoors or in predominantly white communities, reflect a racialized conception of the drug problem. In fact, studies showed that whites were actually more likely than people of color to be carrying illegal drugs or contraband in their vehicles. This is followed by showing many statistics about racial police profiling. I mean, look at it this way. During the height of the so-called crack epidemic, African Americans doing crack were targeted while whites doing cocaine were basically ignored. On top of this, crack was punished 100 times harsher than cocaine.
We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Okay, well, if policing is so obviously racist, couldn't people just sue for racial discrimination or something?
Well, unfortunately, Alexander demonstrates through several court cases that the Supreme Court has now closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias at every stage of the criminal justice process. From stops and searches to plea bargaining and sentencing, the system of mass incarceration is now, for all practical purposes, thoroughly immunized from claims of racial bias. The war on drugs was explicitly designed to be racist, and the government has helped to take away our rights against police and to take away our ability to challenge racist policing and racist criminal justice. Chapter 4: The Cruel Hand. This chapter is about the caste system that is being an ex-con. That is to say that ideally serving your time would be enough, but the punishment goes far past that and into discrimination in housing, both public and private, discrimination in employment, discrimination in state assistance, and even discrimination in voting. As Alexander states, today, discrimination against felons, criminal suspects, and their families is routine among public and private landlords alike. She continues, public housing officials are free to reject applicants simply on the basis of arrests, regardless of whether they resulted in convictions or fines. Alexander looks at things like the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 and the Quality Housing and Work Responsibilities Act of 1998 as major culprits, pun intended, in this issue. Now, it's commonly known that checking the little box on an application that says you have been convicted of a crime is extremely damning, but Alexander brings up a more interesting point. People who can't afford college used to be able to get well-paid manufacturing jobs. However, with deindustrialization, the service sector has come to dominate the jobs available to the American working class. And, unlike the manufacturing sector, in the service sector, interacting with customers is the focus, and so appearance and social status greatly impact the chances at employment. In other words, where racial and anti-convict bias might not have stopped folks from getting jobs in manufacturing, these barriers have been incredibly high in the service industry, which has become the predominant area for employment in our modern era. On top of having extremely restricted access to employment, folks leaving jail often have debt or are facing future debt. As Alexander explains, throughout the United States, newly released prisoners are required to make payments to a host of agencies. In some jurisdictions, ex-offenders are billed for drug testing and even for the drug treatment they are supposed to receive as a condition of parole. Alexander argues that these restrictions on employment and the debts often push people into the illegal economy as a way to make ends meet and to pay the debts, which can of course cause them to lose employment or housing and even land them right back in jail. In regards to public services, Alexander states, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Program, TANF, imposes a 5-year lifetime limit on benefits and requires welfare recipients, including those who have young children and lack childcare, to work in order to receive benefits. The law also requires that states permanently bar individuals for drug-related felony convictions from receiving federally funded public assistance. And in regards to voting, she states, the United Nations Human Rights Committee has charged that U.S. disenfranchisement policies are discriminatory and violate international law. Alexander argues that the tough-on-crime atmosphere and the bad guy ex-con stigmas are also incredibly damning on their own, While folks face discrimination in all aspects of life, housing, employment, and voting, they also get very little solidarity from the outside world. They're ostracized by families and communities for being a risk to their public housing or their employment, or even just because of their felony status. And Alexander concludes, as a society, our decision to heap shame and contempt upon those who struggle and fail in a system designed to keep them locked up and locked out says far more about ourselves than it does about them. If we had actually learned to show love, care, compassion, and concern across racial lines during the civil rights movement, rather than go colorblind, mass incarceration would not exist today. Chapter 5, The New Jim Crow. This chapter compares the old Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow, looking at what makes them similar and what makes them different. Alexander argues, Jim Crow and mass incarceration have similar political origins. Both caste systems were born, in part, due to a desire among white elites to exploit the resentments, vulnerabilities, and racial biases of poor and working class whites for political or economic gain, as we saw in that clip about the drug war that we saw earlier. She continues, the most obvious parallel between Jim Crow and mass incarceration is legalized discrimination. Other similarities include disenfranchisement, exclusion from juries, and racial segregation. Alexander explains that the parallels are not perfect, and this is because the new Jim Crow evolved from the old. For example, this new system is racially indifferent, despite the fact that people of color are disproportionately stopped, searched, arrested, and convicted for crimes that white people are proportionally more likely to commit. And that's not to say that there are no white victims, but that also serves to justify the current order.
The police aren't racist. Some police are black. Not only that, sometimes white people get arrested.
Well, if you haven't been paying attention to the text, you would see that these exceptions only serve to prove the rule. And one of the most damning evolutionary differences between the old Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow is that some people of color support the tough on crime rhetoric. And to be honest, they do so for justified reasons. They're sick of drugs in school, or gang violence, or fear that a loved one might join or is in a gang, or they're just fed up with crime in general. And of course, no small part of this is due to the fact that the federal government is much more willing to wage a war on drugs and crime than to properly fund education and provide jobs for areas that face ghettoization and deindustrialization. Alexander argues, the genius of the current caste system and what most distinguishes it from its predecessors is that it appears voluntary. However, all people make mistakes. All of us are sinners. All of us are criminals. All of us violate the law at some point in our lives. Or as I said in my Are Prisons Obsolete review, have you ever drank or been drunk in public? Got into a heated disagreement with someone, or stole a candy bar, or drove recklessly, or jaywalked, or smoked weed? Hell, I did all those things today. And Alexander concludes, the new system does not seek primarily to benefit unfairly from black labor, as earlier caste systems have, but instead views African Americans as largely irrelevant and unnecessary to the newly structured economy, an economy that is no longer driven by unskilled labor. It is fair to say that we have witnessed an evolution in the United States, from a racial caste system based entirely on exploitation, slavery, to one based largely on subordination, Jim Crow, to one defined by marginalization, mass incarceration. Chapter 6, The Fire This Time. This is the concluding chapter which explains what is to be done. The chapter starts with an anecdote about a mass protest that followed an incident where a noose was hung from a tree at a school. The problem with this protest is that we tend to think of racism as white hoods and swastikas and nooses, and this clouds the reality of systemic racism. This is followed by analyzing why the civil rights movement had been quiet on mass incarceration, and though the reasons are numerous, the main culprits, again pun intended, are not wanting to work with bad guys, aka playing the respectability politics game, and other appeals to power, such as focusing on affirmative action or legislative victories. But Alexander argues, the new caste system will not be overthrown by isolated victories in legislatures or courtrooms. We need a takeover, not a makeover. Alexander then lists many solutions such as ending the war on drugs, ending financial incentives that lead to racial policing, ending drug forfeiture laws, ending practices that allow racial profiling and militarization of the police, and removing mandatory drug sentencing and focusing on treatment. Though I'd say decriminalizing drugs altogether is the solution on that one. And Alexander is not blind to the cost of these changes. Removing just non-violent drug offenders from prisons would cost millions of jobs. The prison industrial complex employs millions of people. Not only guards and security personnel, but also kitchen and logistical staff. And what about all the manufacturing, from the manufacturing of beds and doors and food and the guards' equipment, etc., etc.? And not only this, but if we released all those non-violent drug offenders, there are no jobs waiting for them on the outside. That doesn't mean that these changes aren't absolutely necessary, they are, but it's just about being realistic about the impact. Michelle Alexander does not go as far as Angela Davis, leaning into the full prison abolition stance. Rather, she argues, we need an effective system for crime prevention and control in our communities, but that is not what the current system is. This system is better designed to create crime. She continues, the colorblindness ideal is premised on the notion that we, as a society, can never be trusted to see race and treat each other fairly or with genuine compassion. A commitment to color consciousness, by contrast, places faith in our capacity as humans to show care and concern for others, even as we are fully cognizant of race and possible race differences. The idea that we may never reach a state of perfect racial equality, a perfect racial equilibrium, is not cause for alarm. What is concerning is the real possibility that we, as a society, will choose not to care. We will choose to be blind to injustice and the suffering of others. And Alexander adds, the empirical evidence strongly supports the conclusion that declining wages, downsizing, deindustrialization, globalization, and cutbacks in government services represents much greater threats to the positioning of white men than so-called reverse discrimination. Alexander then argues against trickle-down racial justice, which, like other trickle-down policies, does not work at all. Waiting for a few black police and a few black politicians to overhaul the entire structure of systemic racism will not work. And Alexander concludes, in retrospect, it seems clear that nothing could have been more important in the 1970s and 1980s than finding a way to create a durable, interracial, bottom-up coalition for social and economic justice to ensure that another caste system did not emerge from the ashes of Jim Crow. Priority should have been given to figuring out some way for poor and working-class whites to feel as though they had some stake, some tangible interest in the nascent, integrated racial order. If the movement that emerges to end mass incarceration does not meaningfully address the racial divisions and resentments that gave rise to mass incarceration, and if it fails to cultivate an ethic of genuine care, compassion, and concern for every human being of every class, race, and nationality within our nation's borders, including poor whites, who are often pitted against poor people of color, the collapse of mass incarceration will not mean the death of racial caste in America. Inevitably, a new system of racial, social control will emerge, one that we cannot foresee, just as the current system of mass incarceration was not predicted by anyone 30 years ago. No task is more urgent for racial justice advocates today than ensuring that America's current racial caste system is its last. Oh, I think I get it now. That's good, Straw Dog. But there's much work to be done. Conclusion.
This book by Michelle Alexander, I read it during the comprehensive exams during my PhD that I dropped out of. And I will say about it, though, it is, even inside and outside of academia, it's had a massive impact. The idea that this prison industrial complex really is trying to secure a form of unpaid labor and re-enslave and resegregate black people and Latino people out of the American population is no surprise. America holds about 3% of the world's population and something like 22% of the prison population. Americans aren't just committing a whole lot more crimes. There's definitely more going on. And with the difficult racial history that the United States has, it is of no surprise that black people are imprisoned at much higher numbers than other groups of people because of systemic racism. Given that the 13th Amendment does have an exception for sentences in prison, this means that there's a lot of prison labor that is either unpaid or extremely underpaid, and primarily uses people of color as the bodies that do that unpaid labor. And sometimes it's your typical old chain gang ideas of breaking rocks on the side of the roads, and sometimes it's now done by private corporations where prisoners will now like work at phone banks doing IT for people and things like that. And that's if that isn't like a neoliberal hell world idea, I don't know what is. It's also a way to enforce Jim Crow-esque laws while using colorblind language. This is why using the idea of colorblind liberalism is actually a mask for racism rather than a denial of racism, as some might try to tell you. But hey, this is Radical Reviewer, not normal take reviewer. I think that this goes even deeper to the idea of carceral systems themselves, and the idea of using prisons as a form of retributive justice has all sorts of super problematic elements in it. This is one of many, many reasons why you'll never have a just prison system, and really the only way to move towards a state of justice is to move past the concept of prisons altogether, which is one of those things that even a lot of left-wing people have issues rolling around in their heads, but it's something that we must investigate and explore and move towards something that's more of a restorative justice model rather than retributive.
This text seems very academic, with an introduction that easily breaks down the chapters of the text, and chapter intros that easily explain the arguments of the chapter, followed by several sections which highlight key aspects of the chapter's argument. This text was clearly designed to be curriculum for college courses. Because of this, the text does benefit from being extremely accessible and functioning well as a textbook, one to be read in its entirety or even to be simply used as a reference. My one contention would be that by having this college text mass appeal angle, it was unable to lean into the prison abolition conclusion that Are Prisons Obsolete did. And because of this, the text is lacking in the radical politics and radical solutions I was hoping for. That said, the new Jim Crow is filled with the information and arguments explaining our prison industrial complex and our systemic racism in the United States, which makes this text a must-read for activists, policymakers and scholars, and any other folks concerned with racial justice in America.
Hey Radical Reviewer fans, I am Tristan from the channel Step Back History. I am a history YouTuber. Radical Reviewer is a very good YouTube channel and run by a very, very good boy. If you are interested in more to talk about history, especially American history, because that's my forte, you can go over to Step Back History and subscribe. And of course, if you haven't, you should subscribe to Radical Reviewer too.
If you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.
In so many cells across so many states, so many are doing their time. Well, we hear these myths about rehab as if these structures were reducing crime. Incarceration and the rate of crime, the correlation, yes, they ain't there. But it sends out a message to the dispossessed, telling them all to beware, and you can't ignore the real problem. Listen to what they say, but for those behind bars, these lies are so far from what they know is reality.